So welcome to the video on trade. This is really the heart of the matter of why there were significant changes in the time period following 1500 that makes it very different than the world that came before. So here's the big picture. By 1500, regional trade patterns had developed that linked Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and Europe all into one huge network. And this trade was encouraged and shaped by the geography of those regions. Here are our two objectives. We will analyze the major trade patterns of 1500 CE by writing explanations of the geographical factors that shaped trade, but also we will cite the major technological and scientific exchanges that occurred along those routes by noting their presence in your video study guides. So that's a pretty easy one to do. So let's talk about trade. What if you wanted to be a European merchant in the time up to 1500? Well, let's check in on who you are at that time. Are you a noble? You've not that much reason to trade because you're making a lot of money off of your peasants making food for you. What if you're a serf or a peasant, though? Good luck. Maybe try selling some of the surplus food that you have, if you have any. If you're an artisan, well, great. You could save your money and make some connections and eventually maybe make it into a merchant's guild if they allow it, but they're very protective. But if you're already a merchant, well, try investing money with trade missions that are pretty consistently bringing back money, like trading local food surplus or trade in nearby raw materials like irons or silver, especially. But if you're feeling more adventurous, then you could go just about anywhere. It all depends on where you start. So there were a couple major regional trade routes, and it did result in a large network that eventually all linked together, but it's important to talk about them in terms of the main regions because the trade goods traveled along them are different. And I won't read through all of these because I'm actually going to show you these on a map, but these, if you're going to copy them down for your notes, are the descriptions that you need to know. Because here is the map showing all of them. So here's the Silk Road, right there, from Asia, China over here to the Mediterranean basin, which is this zone right there. You see the maritime routes from Eastern Asia all the way up here. So this is the Indian Ocean trade, because this is the Indian Ocean right here. You see the Northern European links with the Black Sea. This is the Black Sea, this little tiny thing right here. That's the Black Sea. And here's Northern Europe. So here's this line of trade, the black line here, coming down from Northern Europe. You also have Western European sea and river trade, and that's important because it's all of the trade that happened inside of Europe was along these purple lines. These are the main lines of trade. And you also have the Eastern Asian trade routes down here, the South China Sea and lands of Southeast Asia. And finally, here you have the Trans-Saharan routes across North Africa. And in each of these systems, they traded different things. So let's take a look at that. So here's the Silk Road, and you can see all these different goods that were traded across it. But the main ones, obviously, there's silk and cotton, so a lot of textile objects. Textiles, any sort of thread that you can use to make clothes, especially the clothes themselves are textiles. You also had gold and silver coming over. You had ceramics, like perhaps you've heard of China, as in the ceramics from China. Ceramics are stuff that's made out of clay and then fired to become hard. And you also had metalwork and crystal and oil and amber and peacock feathers. And coming over from Europe were things, like wine and woven goods and metalwork. And you had wool rugs and different textiles and dates, which are those weird little awesome dry fruit things. And camels were a large feature of actually traveling along the Silk Road because it goes through some desert areas. Now, the Indian Ocean trade, which you can see here, started in these areas of China and some of the Eastern Asian zones and went through these island areas and all the way in and across India, especially going through a place called Calicut, and then over up into the major gulfs, like the Persian Gulf that's right here in the Red Sea, which allowed them to reach areas close enough to the other trade zones around the Mediterranean. But you also see the Indian Ocean trade comes down here along the eastern coast of Africa, and there were major trade cities like Mogadishu and down here in, off of Madagascar and Mozambique, just important trade cities in those areas. And it was a lot of the same materials that were on the Silk Road were in the Indian Ocean trade routes, but it's easier to transport things by water than it is by land. So you could transport the heavier things for less money. Now here's the Trans-Saharan trade routes. And you can see here, this is actually a Moroccan gold coin that was used to trade in the Songhai Empire, because here's the Songhai Empire. See the area shaded there. And here are the major settlements. And here the trade routes are marked in red, and the goods are marked in black arrow lines, and you can see them written there. So salt was traveling into this area from various other salt mines in the area. You had gold coming up from Western Africa. You had textiles and ivory and slaves and fish, but especially gold and salt and slaves were important commodities. Commodities are things that you trade, and they were important commodities in this area. And they're still today known for the salt and the gold part, because salt you really need to make food last a long time in this time period, so it was incredibly valuable. And gold it's gold. So here are the European trade routes, and there's a couple different kinds. So in this time period, there were two major cities that were in control of a lot of the trade, and that's Venice right here and Genoa. And you can see the Venetian trade routes, that's Venice's trade routes in blue, and you can see the Genoan, as in of Genoa, trade routes in red. The place where they have routes that go along the same lines is in purple here, just to be clear about what that is. And that meant that they were drawing goods from the Silk Road and from these northern European ports. See how you have the northern European trade routes coming down here? They're drawing goods from both places and distributing them in and around Europe, all the way around here even. And they made an enormous amount of money doing that. So here's all these land trade routes and river trade routes within Europe. And here's an area up here called the Hanseatic routes, which are in this northern European sea area. And the Hanseatic League controlled some of these major cities like Hamburg and Lübeck and Danzig, Riga, Reval, Visby. They were major cities in those areas. So here in Southeast Asia, this was an incredibly rich trading zone because of the huge wealth of China and the tiny areas you could actually get from this China Sea over into the area where you could get to India for the trade goods that were over there. So there's these, right here, there's the Straits of Malacca, and there were empires that grew up there all the time because controlling that trade was incredibly valuable, and China even had an interest in doing that in the time before the Europeans came to dominate this area. So what would be stopping you? Like what's making it hard to trade during this time period? Well, there's really long travel times because they don't have planes, they don't have cars, they don't have trains. So you got to go by boat, which is nice, that's the good kind, or you got to go by, I don't know, having donkeys and walking. So your life expectancy was short because you didn't have great nutrition, disease is crazy, and also bandits, pirates, tolls, taxes, robber baron, just like there's all these people who are kind of maybe going to kill you or at least take all your stuff. So your life was short enough that it might not be worth it. You didn't have great tools to navigate with. If you were going by sea, you had no good ways of predicting storms, and prices were changing all the time. So it takes you a long time to get there, and the prices might be different when you get there, and so your trade goods might lose money when you have to trade them away. And yet, merchants still did it, because if you got rich, you could become unreasonably, improbably, unusually rich. This is a great Renaissance painting by Quentin Metzis, and it's called the Moneylenders, and you can see all this gold, the double entry bookkeeping you got going on over here, and it's just a representation of the fact that merchants could make a lot of coin. But also, here's an actual artifact from that time period. It's the St. Wolfgang altarpiece by Michael Patcher. And that stuff, that is gold. That is a whole bunch of lumps of really, really nicely made up gold. And that's what European merchants did. They threw their money around making really beautiful things during the Renaissance in particular. So how would you know whether trading would be worth it to you? Well, geographical location had a lot to do with it. If you're close to major trade routes, if you're close to the origins of major trade goods, if you found that there were extra surplus goods for trade, and often trade was worth it because creating everything yourself is more expensive in terms of time and skill and materials. Like, you don't make your own shoes today because there are much cheaper ways, easier ways that cost society less for you to get shoes, because you can actually, you're more valuable to society when you're learning right now than you would be making shoes. Crazy, right? So generally, though, there's also this issue of mutual benefit on like a national level. If you specialize over here, this is a basic economic idea. Like if this nation over here specializes in one thing and this other nation specializes in another thing, then when they trade with each other, they both benefit. And there's lots of argument about that and how that actually plays out in the world, but does actually become a useful set of ideas during this time period of increased trade. So while you're trading, you might see the sights, as in experience new things, like learning new languages and manners, which makes it easier to work with other people from other places. You might have an increased interest in literature. Particularly in Europe, the demand for books increases a lot during this time period. Ideas came over into Europe as a result of these trades, like Arabic numerals, like 1, 2, and 3. Because I don't know if you've encountered Roman numerals, but it's like I, and then I, and then IV. It's like great. It's not that useful for doing math, especially. Um, and then technology. And technology then helps you trade better in some cases. So let's look at the technology here. You get paper and the compass, which is very important for traveling, and silk and porcelain technology coming from China. And you had textiles, like we talked about earlier, and the numeral system coming from India and the Middle East. India had that concept of zero, which is a big deal. It's pretty cool. Scientific knowledge also came from India and the Middle East. Some of it was knowledge that came from the Greeks and was translated into the language of the Islamic empires, Arabic, and then was being translated, into Latin. And so that was a lot of knowledge of medicine and astronomy, but also the Indians and the people in the Islamic empires improved on and added their own ideas to those systems. And so that's all for trade today.